So I was talking about conflict and going towards conflict, and something seems to derive itself from that, that peace is confrontation. Avoidance is war or conflict. And even violence is avoidance, because violence doesn't actually tackle the issue. Violence is like an excuse. The anger that rises up into violence is an anger that wants something, right? There is something the anger wants and is not getting. And usually, if you're really angry with someone, that it's usually not that you want them to disappear. If you want someone to disappear, it's usually because you've already entered the realm of the symbolic, and that person represents your shadow. It represents something inside of you that you think that by scratching that itch, it's going to go away. But once you get rid of that person, another person is going to fill that role. There is a role in you that angers you, and people who enter that role get your anger. So by escalating into violence, things get avoided. The real issue, whatever kind of roles or shadows or kind of archetypal stuff is going on, gets completely avoided. The violence is like a scapegoat. You're sort of acting out a little kind of play to avoid the conflict. And so in that sense too, the avoidance of the conflict is precisely the violence. The violence emerges from the avoidance. Violence is somehow like symbolic. Sometimes you're angry with someone because you want something and the other person is crucial in that role. Otherwise you wouldn't be angry. If the other person's consciousness is not important to you, there is nothing to be angry about. The fact that you're angry at them is it sort of speaks to your desire for a resolution that is like language based, or that is actually tackled, and that resolution the possibility for that gets destroyed with violence. It gets completely clouded by violence, so it doesn't arrive. So violence is avoidance. By avoiding the confrontation, violence emerges. And by going head on into the confrontation, peace emerges. And going head on into a confrontation, I mean, there is also a symbolic thing in that as well, because if we're dealing with roles and projections, what certain people's actions or behaviors represent for you in your life and the value you've applied to them and all of that, by discussing them, you're engaging in psychoanalysis together. Like you're going through a process of bringing things into consciousness by going into confrontation. And it's this process of things being brought into consciousness that seems to be peace. And this sort of confrontation it can be more abstract. I'm giving examples about people fighting or talking, but I'm mostly thinking of like things that seem violent to us that we avoid in our life. Like a certain task that you've got to do, but you're avoiding doing it. Maybe it doesn't involve other people directly. At some level it probably does, but it can be just like a task, some sort of event, something that you need to give yourself sort of give energy to, and you're avoiding that. That sort of confrontation, that sort of conflict between your desires and the desires of the world or something. And I have talked already in other videos where somehow these moments of confrontation where your will gets sort of subordinated to something else, or you don't get to do what you want, are ironically the periods of greatest creativity, at least in my life, where when I am completely free in my own will, are usually the moments when I can't sort of make music, I can't write. I feel completely blocked. But moments when the world is demanding a lot from me, or I need to go to this place and I need to do this, and I need to do things that are not what I want to do. At those moments, suddenly, I'm able to create. The explanation I'd always given myself was that, well, because I have less time, suddenly the act of creation that is so important to me becomes even more important because you have less time to do it. So you notice the limited time you have, and suddenly it becomes crucial to act. Whereas when the panorama stretches out infinitely in front of you and there's no duties, no obligations, either because you don't have any, or because you're avoiding them, or because you're ignoring them, in those moments where you're just this eternal plane, you completely lose awareness of the importance of doing what you want to do, even though those are the moments where your will is completely undisturbed. So in theory, your will could do what it wants to do. But it seems more like, actually, it's not so much that being busy is like an enriching moment in which to create, but more that actually these two things are much more inextricable than I thought, because saying it that way makes it sound as if, saying it that way makes it sound as if creating is an action that's independent of context and situation. That if you find yourself in a busy moment where you have little time to do things, yeah, you could be stimulated to create, but you could also be stimulated to create in another situation. That it's simply a good setting, but not necessary. But I'm starting to think that maybe it's more like a necessary setting, in the same way that a snowy mountain is necessary for skiing, something like that, or that water, an ocean, is necessary for sailing, whatever. That actually self-expression is an effect, is a consequence of being limited, of having your will challenged by external wills. Terence McKenna has talks where he defends the act of creativity as almost the most important thing that one can do in life. And this is it's very broad, of course, because creativity doesn't just have to be fine art or something. It can be expressing yourself, or at least I think it has to do simply with expressing yourself. Not just thinking or imagining, but actually sort of manifesting them in some way into physical reality, be it with airwaves or text on a page or things like that, actually making them physical. In that sense, it's creating, right? You're creating physical objects out of your mind, which is ironic because it's exactly what Terence McKenna describes about the DMT experience, that the creatures you encounter in the DMT experience, the elves, they create objects with their language. And you could see that as a visual metaphor for the act of creativity itself. That creativity, no matter how ethereal, is always physical. No matter how, music or poetry, speaking, dance, it's all physical. Because if it's not physical, it's inside your head. But in order for the world to see it, or in order for other people, and maybe more importantly, in the process of your own analysis, in order for you to see it, it needs to be physical. Because as long as it's in your head, you don't see it. You get the illusion that you're seeing it. You have like a poem in your head, and maybe you know it line for line. But until you write it down or say it, you don't see it. When you say it, it enters into your own ears. When you write it, you see it through your own eyes. When it's in your head, you're just imagining it. And there is something about the materialization of inner language that seems to be essential for you to actually see it. This, as I've said before, is clearest to me in keeping a dream journal, in the act of keeping a dream journal, because you could remember a dream perfectly well. In fact, there are dreams I remember right now which I have not written down. And I know that from experience that you write something down, you write a dream down, and it changes everything. You don't imagine it. You think there will be nothing new added to your knowledge of it by writing it down. But there is something really weird, there's something very uncanny about seeing your inner world materialized, which has an effect on the psyche. When it's inside of you, it can't have that effect, because your eyes or your ears are not seeing it or hearing it. It's not a question of knowledge, it's a question more of perception, of perceiving a thing, and you can't perceive it as long as it's in your head, at least not in that way. So Terence McKenna suggests creativity is very important. And I would like to argue that this sort of endorsement of creativity is not disconnected to his endorsement of psychedelic drugs. And I think that he is completely aware of this. It's simply that there is a popular image of Terence McKenna, I think, on the internet, because his long talks get cut up into chunks, There's little like quotes, memorable quotes that get uploaded again and again, and repeated again and again, like he himself said. I mean, that his hope was to turn into a meme in some way. And I think that he has achieved that. But of course, inevitably, he has achieved that only with a certain part of his thoughts. And there is another part that I think is unrepresented at least as much, and that I would like to focus on more. One part that I think doesn't get represented much is the sort of metaphorical nature of a lot of what he's saying. And I claim that he himself says this in many of his lectures. When he's talking about the time wave, he says, the time wave sort of, I'm drawing it on graph paper, but it actually makes no sense to draw it on graph paper because I'm talking about something that exceeds the limits of what it's trying to convey. It's a metaphor. But that doesn't mean that it's not real. As you know, synchronicity can show. You can have, I mean, the weird thing with synchronicity is that it's symbolic, and that implies a lot of things, because it's not just that you're perceiving different things in different times, but they're all the same thing in different times and so on. It's that those things that you're perceiving are symbolic, so they are metaphoric at some level. And yet it is occurring in your real waking experience. Even beyond synchronicity, sort of metaphor is more of like a way of relating to experience or something. It's not just a condiment or like a complement to language. It's sometimes described as a decoration, that you can write normal words, but you can also use symbols and metaphors which are pretty and decorative, like flowers or something. But there are things that can't be explained if it's not with metaphor and symbol. Precisely because they're not being orchestrated by the conscious mind, because they're being structured by the unconscious mind. And the unconscious mind doesn't speak with the same language that the conscious mind does. So one of the ways in which Terence McKenna seems to be metaphoric to me is in his defense of psychedelic drugs. And this may be weird because on the one hand he is literally defending psychedelic drugs, but I think that on the other side he's also saying something else, or that at least the totality of his work paints a picture that no single Terence McKenna talk actually gives, but that all of them together point to, in my opinion. One of them is the fact that he is focusing on how drugs get more and more intense the closer they get to ordinary brain chemistry. That, mushrooms is less disruptive than LSD, for example, and it's better assimilated by brain chemistry. And then DMT is even better assimilated by brain chemistry and is almost the same as brain chemistry. And it seems as if the closer you get to the brain, the more intense the psychedelic experience is. That's one thing that he's pointing to. Another thing he's pointing to is how creativity has this powerful psychedelic component to it, which sort of dredges up the depths of the unconscious imagination and brings them out, manifests them, which is what he claims to be the most important thing of the psychedelic experience in the first place, which is to bring something back. You don't go to the psychedelic experience just to enjoy yourself, but to bring something back that can actually be shown to other people, be it an idea, a painting, so on. So in a way, he's saying that the psychedelic experience is important because in there you will encounter ideas that you'd never encountered before, and then you can come back and express them. So his recommendation of art and creativity as a good solution to human problems is linked to his recommendation of psychedelics. It's not just that psychedelics are like a medicine that you will take it and it will just cure you, even though at one level he does believe that. But it's also that the psychedelic experience heals you precisely because it is an encounter with the other. If it was an encounter, that's why he thinks LSD is less interesting than mushrooms, because LSD, in his opinion, it stays more at the psychoanalytical level, at a level that's more easily understandable by the conscious mind, whereas mushrooms go deeper into the unconscious and bring stuff out that doesn't fit into the common psychoanalytic model, and then DMT even more than that, right? So he's saying, yes, it's an encounter with the other. And precisely because our problem as a species, our neuroses, the fact that we are, killing one another, killing the environment, killing sort of everything that we are connected to, it seems to show a lack of consciousness about the fact that you can't sort of cut your own legs off, which is what humanity is doing at the moment. Right? So the solution is gnosis. The solution is consciousness, becoming aware of our situation. And this knowledge can't come from culture, because culture is it's the substance the problem is made of. So only the absolutely other to culture can do this, and this is what he sees in the psychedelic experience. However, the psychedelic experience, as he says in other talks, gets more and more intense the closer it gets to the human brain. So on the one hand, he is defending psychedelics, and he is saying, well, there is no need to do this naturally, on the natch. And there is no desire to do it naturally, because we want a contained space where you can have an extreme experience and come back from it. And psychedelics are like the perfect containment of that. If you were to train yourself to do that naturally, it could go wrong. Maybe you would fall into that state forever and enter into an eternal psychosis, right? The good thing about the psychedelics is precisely they are an artifact that activates and deactivates that state. And in that sense, I agree with him, and in that sense, I'm interested in psychedelics. But I also think that when one says, well, you could do it naturally, it doesn't necessarily have to be as intense as a heroic dose. Here is where I think I might disagree with McKenna. I mean, the interesting thing is that the more I think about Terence McKenna, the more I realize that on the one hand, he has been one of the most important thinkers in my life, and at the same time, I almost disagree with him on a lot of the crucial points. And maybe that's precisely why he's so important to me. But in any case, the heroic dose to McKenna is important precisely because it's an encounter with the other. Anything superficial is just play, entertainment. You know, music sounds better, colours are brighter, and so on. But a true heroic dose is a sort of blast into another place. But two things come to mind for me with this, is that on the one hand, precisely this insight that psychedelics get stronger the closer they get to the brain, to me makes me see more clearly than ever that psychedelics are connected, or the psychedelic experience is essentially the same as the dream. The psychedelics are just a way for activating dreams while you're awake. Because, in my opinion, dreams get very weird. The only reason we don't have a clear notion of dreams being as weird as mushrooms or as DMT is simply because we don't have a lot of awareness about dreams. We forget them. They don't linger in the mind the way the psychedelic experience does, right? And Terence says, well, that's the whole point, that by having a container that activates that experience, you can be safe. You don't have to have that happening all the time. But my point is, maybe that is already happening all the time, every night, every time we go to sleep. That dreams, every single night, are intense beyond what we could imagine. It's just that because they're so intense and traumatic, we only remember the tip of them. But that with, again, the key word, with consciousness, with awareness, one could gradually gain more awareness of the dream, remember more and more, and therefore experience more and more the true other at night. So how do you gain awareness? Well, with creativity, with self-expression, basically. Because that's how you bring the things that you don't know, the things that are unconscious, into consciousness, by expressing them. Which is ironically what McKenna considers the sort of the substitute, the cultural substitute for the psychedelic experience. And it's the only cultural substitute that works because it drags stuff down from the imagination, which is beyond culture. So in my opinion, right, maybe a heroic dose is important, but maybe you can have a psychedelic experience on the natch without it being a heroic dose, like just slightly, and that would be creativity, right? If creativity is a psychedelic experience, then obviously it's not as intense as mushrooms, but still it's a psychedelic experience within this sort of definition. So you can have a psychedelic experience naturally, and it's called creativity, because you're like the psychedelic word means, expressing the psyche. Expressing the psyche is self-expression or creativity. So maybe this lower dosage of creativity is precisely moderate enough that you can remember everything that you create. Like Terence McKenna says, if you have an experience that's too intense, you won't be able to remember it, and then you won't be able to bring it back, so there's no use in it. The good thing about doing it naturally and at a low sort of level is that you remember what it is that you're saying. It is crystal clear because it's within the realms of culture, but it's coming from the unconscious, which is beyond the realms of culture. And that union of culture and unconscious keeps it sort of stable but powerful. And it brings consciousness. So that through this low-level psychedelia, you could increase your awareness of the dream. You can stimulate the dream, which then acts as the ultimate psychedelic experience, not just the substitute. Because if the dream is the central point where all psychedelics are aiming at, right? So mushrooms, DMT, dreams. If dreams is not a substitute but the origin point of psychedelia, then gaining a deeper awareness of dreams through self-expression and art and creativity would be actually, even though it seems to be a lower dosage, is the passage towards the actual heroic dose. Yeah, anyway, thanks for listening.